In this tutorial, we're going to look at correcting for lighter skin tones. First, we should revisit the Ansel Adams zone system. This image shows the zone system in relation to the Luma waveform in Adobe Premiere. Lighter skin tones are addressed specifically in the zone system between zones 5 through 7, though it's important to understand that skin tones will expand across a range of zones in a properly exposed image. Also, the context of each shot is incredibly important to consider. Shots that are supposed to communicate night for time of day will likely sit in the lower zones, while daytime shots may sit a bit higher than the suggested zones of 5 through 7. For example, I've gone ahead and showed just the talent's facial skin tones on the waveform for this shot that already has a correction applied to it. As you can see, the skin tone Luma ranges all the way from zone 1 to zone 7, with the majority of the skin tones sitting between zones 4 and 6. On this shot, which is lit to convey a bright sunny day, the skin tones range all the way from zone 1 to zone 10, again with the majority of the skin tones sitting between zones 4 and 6. I show these clips as examples to demonstrate that the zone system is a good reference for general guidelines for contrast, but there will be some variation based on the time of day, mood of the scene, and lighting choices. As far as skin tone hue is concerned, we've learned in the past tutorials that the majority of skin tones should lie on the flesh line or the eye bar in the vector scope. While this is true for most skin tones, the position of lighter skin tones can vary on the flesh line. For instance, pale complexions tend to sit on and just to the right of the eye bar, while complexions that are more towards olive may sit on and a little to the left of the eye bar. The final consideration with skin tones is the amount of color. For subjects with pale skin, typically the saturation values should sit right about in this range between 20 and 30% outward from the center of the vector scope. For subjects with average degrees of color in their skin, they'll likely sit between 25 and 40% amplitude, with most sitting around 35%. This first shot could use a pretty significant boost to exposure. Let's do this using the color wheels. Let's bring the shadows up to restore some detail, then increase the highlights until this part of the man's forehead reaches the top of the 6th zone. Then we'll bring the midtones down just a touch, and the shadows back up so that they're just above 0. Now let's focus on color. Since we're focusing on skin tones, let's isolate just the man's face like we have in previous tutorials. We'll go into the effect controls and click on the pen next to opacity, then draw a shape isolating just the skin. Now currently you can see the skin tones sit a bit to the left of the eye bar, so let's isolate the skin tone range on the hue versus hue curve using the eyedropper and drag the middle point up until the left side of the trace is closer to the flesh line. In terms of saturation, this man's skin tones would be considered to be in the normal to olive complexion range, so they should sit between 25 and 40% from the center of the vector scope. Let's go to the basic correction panel and increase the saturation to get us there. Great. Now let's turn off the opacity effect. And here's a before and after of our correction. Okay, moving to the next shot. Let's first adjust for contrast by going to the color wheels, and starting with the shadows control, we'll drag down until the bottom of the trace sits just above 0. Then we'll drag the highlights up until the top of the trace sits right under 100. Then increase the midtones to restore detail in the skin tones. And then drag the shadows back down to restore them to their previous position. Again, isolating just the talent's skin and the vector scope will help us to know where we should go with our color adjustments, so we'll click the pen next to the opacity in the effect controls and draw another rough outline around the talent's skin. Now, red-haired people tend to possess skin with lower saturation levels that sit just to the right of the eye bar. To protect the talent's skin tones, this is where we're going to use the hue saturation curves, specifically the hue versus hue curve. I'll use the eyedropper and click over the skin to isolate just the skin on the curve and drag the middle point up until the left side of the trace lies right along the flesh line. The saturation is in a pretty close spot as we're looking to achieve a saturation level of between 20 and 30% amplitude. So that's looking good. Okay, on to the next shot. We'll need to increase the contrast. We can quickly accomplish this with the contrast control. I'll drag to the right to expand the contrast. Now, like before, we'll use the opacity controls to draw an outline around the town's skin tones so we can just see them in the vector scope. Now, Pel's skin tones should sit on and just to the right of the flesh line, so this trace needs to move back in the opposite direction as it's a bit too far to the right. Using the hue versus hue curve, let's isolate the skin with the eyedropper and then drag the middle point down so that the trace points just to the right of the eye bar. The saturation levels are pretty low, so let's increase the saturation with the hue versus sat curve until the trace reaches between 20 and 30% amplitude. Great. I'll turn off the draw mask effect, and here's the before and after. Lastly, let's take a look at correcting for golden skin tones. Asian skin tones are in this range, but also very tan people can fall into this category as well. Skin tones in this category typically sit farthest to the left of the eye bar of all the skin tones. The saturation levels are also typically the highest, sitting between 35 and 50% from the center of the vector scope. Tan skin tones are on the higher end, while natural skin tones are on the lower end. For this shot, let's adjust for contrast using the color wheels. I'll drag up on the shadows control, then increase the highlights, decrease the midtones, and raise the shadows back up so that they're just above 0. We'll need to isolate the skin tones again. This time, we'll just use a circle mask. I'll click the circle next to the opacity effects and size and position it over our talent's face. The skin tones are a little too far to the left based on the ideals we laid out before, so we can isolate the skin tones with the eyedropper in the hue versus hue curve. Then drag the middle point up slightly. Then in the hue versus sat curve, we'll isolate the skin tones with the eyedropper and add some saturation dragging up on the middle point. Okay, I'll turn off the opacity effect, and that's looking much better. Here's a before and after of that change. Well, I hope this tutorial has helped you to understand how to work with lighter skin tones. Thanks for watching.